Hello and welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the 26th Nigel Walker Lecture. My name is Manuel Eisner. I'm the Wolfson Professor of Criminology and the current Director of the Institute of Criminology. And I'm really delighted to welcome you here and to chair this event. Before we begin, I just wanted to highlight the fire exits in case there is a fire emergency. They're on both sides. Basically, where you came in, you would go out again. So it's pretty straightforward. The Nigel Walker Lecture was established in 1997 in honor of Professor Nigel Walker, CBE, the Institute's second director. He served as Wolfson Professor of Criminology from 1973 to 1984. Nigel had a huge impact on criminology through his pioneering work on sentencing theory and the rational administration of criminal justice. I'll come back to that because it relates to today's talk. Each year, the lecture is delivered by a leading criminologist addressing a topic related to criminal justice, penal ethics, or the causes and prevention of crime. It's our most prestigious annual public event, and we hope it inspires all of us to think more clearly, more critically about the major challenges facing crime and justice today. This year's lecture is particularly special because it's linked to a symposium in honor of David Farrington, who sadly passed away in November last year. David was a towering figure in our field and an inspiration to generations of criminologists. The symposium tomorrow, but also the dinner tonight, will aim to bring together his friends and colleagues to reflect on his work, to spend time thinking in the spirit of David's inquisitive mind about how we can continue to build on his insights. So I warmly welcome all colleagues who have traveled from around the world, arriving today or yesterday to join us for the Nigel Walker Lecture today and the symposium tomorrow. I would specifically like to welcome members of David's family who are either with us today, some of them, or tomorrow. His wife, Sally, his daughters, Alice, Kathy, and Lucy, and some of his grandchildren, Harriet, Bea, Adam, Juliet, and Liz. It's also our valued tradition that the Nigel Walker Lecture includes the presentation of the Nigel Walker Prize. The prize is awarded annually for an outstanding PhD thesis completed by a student of the Institute. It was established through a generous bequest from the late Sir Leon Radzinovitz, the founder and first director of the Institute of Criminology. So the winner of the prize this year is Niklas Goldrosen. Niklas joined the Institute in 2020 as a master's student, and in 2021, he was awarded a Gates Cambridge Scholarship to pursue his PhD under the supervision of Professor Paolo Campana. In his thesis, Essays on Law Enforcement Misconduct and Social Network Analysis, Niklas uses social network analysis and organizational justice as analytic lenses for understanding law enforcement misconduct and finding avenues to better policing. The thesis exemplifies the kind of work we value most here at the Institute. It's theoretically rigorous, methodologically rich, and deeply relevant to practice and policy. Just one brief example in an article on police misconduct hearings as legitimate dialogues in policing and society, he analyzes qualitatively how these hearings work and what is being negotiated during these hearings, using Sir Anthony Bottom's and Professor Justice Tankerby's theoretical work on legitimacy and how legitimacy is negotiated in these forums. Nicholas is now postdoctoral scholar with the Pennsylvania Commission on Sentencing and the Criminal Justice Research Center at Penn State University. Nicholas, if you could come forward, please, my heartfelt congratulations on behalf of the Institute. We also have well done. Thank you. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Professor Lesley McAra. She is Professor of Penology in the School of Law at the University of Edinburgh and currently the Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. She is a former president of the European Society of Criminology and is widely recognized for her pioneering work on youth justice, youth crime, and the sociology of punishment. She's also the co-director with Susan McVie of the prize-winning Edinburgh study on youth transitions and crime, one of the largest and most influential longitudinal studies in criminology today, with a cohort of around 4,300 participants. Findings from this work, and I'm sure Lesley will talk about this, have been utilized in penal reform campaigns, both nationally and internationally, and have formed the principal evidence base for a range of youth justice policies and reforms in Scotland. In recognition of her exceptional contributions in criminology, Lesley was awarded a CBE in 2018 and elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2021. She has received multiple awards for research impact, including the Outstanding Public Policy Impact Award by the Economic and Social Sciences Research Council. Now, we live in a time of political turbulence and pressing challenges in justice systems here and elsewhere. The topic of Lesley McAra's lecture today, Justice in an Age of Unreason, Why Criminology Matters, speaks directly to Nigel Walker's concerns, expressed, for example, in his 1969 book, Sentencing in a Rational Society, where he called for rationality, fairness, and evidence-based thinking in criminal sentencing. And her thoughts are even more timely on this very day, as the UK government has just released its independent sentencing review, which makes major proposals for comprehensive reform of the sentencing framework. So we have three links here that come together in your talk. Lesley, it's a great pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to give this lecture. It's an honour and an absolute pleasure to be back at the Institute here in Cambridge. It's also deeply moving to be giving this lecture on the eve of the event tomorrow, celebrating the life and scholarly legacy of Professor David Farrington. And I'm going to close my contribution this evening with a personal tribute to him from me. I have brought along the book that you can see here. This is the first edition. I don't know if it's very valuable. It was Derek McClintock, who was the second ever chair of criminology in the UK after Professor Radzinovich. In Edinburgh he was, and this was, I have got his archive of books, and in it, interestingly, there's one thing that says, Judge has planned to beat crime, from the Daily Telegraph in 1966. So that's kind of present. And then some of Derek's doodling. So these are for sale if anyone was. Anyway, I've just also had an absolutely lovely session with your PhD students, and can I congratulate you on having such amazing PhD students doing wonderful work and just so interesting. And I hope that universities will continue to support the early career scholar. These are difficult times for early career scholars. They're a real precariat. And I think all of you that I've spoken to have got obviously very, very wonderful futures ahead of you. And do think of applying to IASH, because I mentioned that to them as well. Anyway, let me get on with the lecture. So the title of my lecture is Justice in an Age of Unreason, why criminology matters. Now, as many of you in the room will know, this year, 2025, marks the 60th anniversary of the publication of Nigel Walker's book, Crime and Punishment in Britain, published by Edinburgh University Press. In the preface to the first edition, Walker draws a distinction between criminologists and penal reformers. For Walker, criminology should not concern itself with moral or political inquiry as penal reformers are wont to do, but rather should focus on, I quote, logical or purely scientific appreciation of fact. Against this contemporary international backdrop that we're living through, characterised by political precarity and turmoil and threats to the very foundations of democracy and the rule of law, what I have termed this age of unreason, this lecture is going to address the central question raised by Walker's preface: what should be the appropriate concerns of criminology today? Rather than eschewing moral or political inquiry, my overall argument will be that an understanding of both crime and punishment in late modern society requires a differentiated analytical approach, exploring the flow and sometimes disjuncture between crime and punishment as political strategy, as institutional cultural practice, and as embodied experience. An approach which I believe also raises important questions for the positionality and moral responsibilities of researchers themselves. I'm going to come back to that point at the very end of the lecture. Now, my argument is going to conjoin sociological with etiological analysis, foregrounding the dynamics of regulatory orders over time at the structural, meso-institutional, and individual levels as critical to any exploration of penal transformation or individual development through the life course. Now, this model on this side is adapted from Bronfenbrenner and Martin's work in 1993, and also helpfully in the Oxford Handbook of Criminology in Tony Bottom's and Paul Wiles' chapter as well. And what it aims to do for me anyway is a visual representation of some of the meso and more individual environmental factors which play a role in shaping child development and behaviour, from family and friends through to critical policies related to education, housing and more. And I've added into the Bronfenbrenner and Martin's original model a further layer, this sort of blue layer on the outside there, which I put in as criminal and civil justice, security and defence. And of course, many of these immediate environmental influences that are shown in this model, these things will shift over time as the child matures into adulthood, leaving school, maybe going to work, developing new relationships. Similarly, the policy framings that are available in that, as you can see in that model, they too will alter over time as governments come and go. And the whole of this model is situated within the broader structural context, driven in turn by the vagaries of secular change. Now, the focus of my lecture is really going to be on the outer ring of this model, although the work that Susan McVie and I are working on at the moment, our book, we are going to be exploring all the regulatory context of the whole model. But today I just want to look at the blue ring around there. So looking at the contextual factors which shape the regulatory dynamics of youth and adult criminal justice and the ways in which they impact children and adults as they develop over the life course. I'm going to develop my argument and explore its implications, drawing on Scotland as a case study. Now, Walker's preface to Crime and Punishment in Britain really made me laugh out loud when he talked about the Scots being proud to the point of narcissism about differences between our jurisdiction and England. Sometimes maybe a bit narcissistic. But as he also wrote, and I would agree, and I quote this is not to suggest that Scottish differences are necessarily for the better, but merely to emphasise the fact that the boundaries of practical possibility are wider than many believe. More specifically then, the empirical reference for the lecture stem from two programmes of research which I've pursued across my career. Firstly, the impact of multi-level governance on crime and its control, exploring Scottish penal transformation in comparative context. And then secondly, as Manuel was mentioning, the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime, which I co-direct with my great friend and colleague, Susan McVie. And I'll be presenting some of the work I'm presenting on the Edinburgh Study is our joint work tonight. And this is the longitudinal study, as Manuel was saying, of pathways into and out of offending, tracking a cohort of around 4,300 people who started secondary school in the city of Edinburgh in 1998. Now, our study's got multiple sources of data about our cohort. We have self-report questionnaires at various time points, official records, surveys of caregivers, pastoral teachers, semi-structured interviews with subsamples of the cohort at various times. We have a geographic information system too, which includes police recorded crime and census data. The study provides a unique opportunity to analyse the evolution of youth and adult criminal justice policy and its effects at both an institutional and individual level across 3 decades of policy and political transformation. A key point being that people live through different policy eras and that this can have cumulative impacts on those who come into conflict with the law. Now, I'm going to begin the lecture by exploring the longer-term historical context of penal transformation, what may be termed sociological deep time. That's the top line on this diagram there, the secular change bit. I will then examine the dynamics of institutional cultural practices as they have evolved over the past 3 decades, bringing Scotland here as my case study. Then this is going to be followed by an exploration of the ways in which such practices have impacted individual development from childhood into what we're calling early middle age, which we've got as age 35 actually. So if you're 35, I apologise, but you're in early middle age. And I'm going to draw on both quantitative and qualitative data from the Edinburgh study, which is at the bottom line, the maturation line on this diagram. And the lecture will conclude with some reflections on the implications of the evidence presented for the positionality and moral responsibilities of researchers. To quote F.H. Bradley, a 19th century idealist philosopher, what is our station and what should be its duties? On then to the first part in sociological deep time. So why should I consider deep time, what the historian Broadell has called the longue durée? What specific insights does exploration of penal change across history give us on the dynamics of crime and punishment today? Well, 3 of the most influential theorists within the sociology of punishment who have invoked deep time are, of course, Durkheim, through highlighting shifts from mechanical to organic forms of social solidarity, and in doing so foregrounding the moral and emotional components of punishment. Secondly, Elias, with his exploration of the civilizing process from the late medieval period onwards, giving consideration to the tightening and differentiation of controls over time, including refinement of conduct and increased psychological inhibition. And thirdly, Foucault, who, as you all know, tracks transformations across time in the technologies of punishment and penal power from the body to the soul. Here, however, I'm going to draw on the work of 2 theorists, perhaps not so familiar to criminologists, whose ideas about Western cultural evolution have particular resonance for understanding the ways in which regulatory practices transform over time. The first of these is an anthropologist, David Scott, who claims that Western culture has undergone 3 principal phases of development, from the theological to the more secular forms. According to Scott, the epistemological framings of each of the phases has served to construct a series of insider and outsider groups. Political institutions are both shaped and driven by the needs of the insider groups for defended exclusivity in the face of their anxieties about the threats posed by the outsiders. In the Renaissance, he claims the insiders embraced a Christian theology and the outsiders were the infidel, perceived as both conceptually and geographically different and distant. In the period of the Enlightenment, the rational man comes to the centre stage, and those deemed by the rational man as uncivilized and uneducated, that peoples beyond Europe are othered. Again, there is this perceived geographic distance between insiders and outsiders. Within late modernity, however, Scott argues that there has been a major transformation in our sites of anxiety from the external to the internal. According to Scott, cultural relativism is deemed to be a marker of taste. Diversity is valorized in the context of both multiculturalism and the globalized flows of capital, commodities, and people. Cultural absolutism now constitutes the thread, and outsiders are no longer geographically distinct. What I think is critical to draw from Scott's work is not so much the description of particular phases, which may be more or less empirically contestable, but rather the undergirding and sustained dynamics of inclusivity and exclusivity within regulatory orders over the longue durée, and their links both to fear and anxiety, as well as intimacy and connectedness as animating forces. So these sort of dual forces that undermine, that are sort of culturally imbued. The second of my theorists is Anne Swidler. Now, her work explores the causal significance of culture in respect of social action. According to Swidler, cultural influences action, not necessarily by providing the values or aspirations to which action is oriented, but by shaping a repertoire of habits, skills, and styles from which people construct strategies of action. She sets up two models of cultural influence relating to what she terms settled and unsettled lives. During historical periods of social, economic, and political stability, settled lives, culture is diffuse and has low coherence. It is manifested as common sense or custom and is encapsulating rather than competitive. As such, culture has a weak direct control over action, but rather functions as a resource for constructing strategies of action. By contrast, and more importantly for this paper, during periods of major social, economic, and political transformation, unsettled lives, older customary and familiar ways of acting are disrupted as new and more explicitly articulated cultural models come into play. Under these circumstances, culture becomes contested and fragmented and increasingly manifested as ideology. Its accompanying doctrines, symbols, and rituals come to shape action directly as individuals negotiate their way through unfamiliar terrain. According to Swidler, the long-term influence of particular cultures is dependent on structural opportunities for survival. Thus, a key task for the sociologist is to analyse the structural constraints and historical circumstances within which struggles for cultural domination take place. Knotting the ideas of Scott and Swidler together then, the mutually constitutive relationships between narratives of anxiety and institutional forms, and the conditions under which struggles for cultural domination can be resolved or not, arguably provides a helpful framework for empirical interrogation of the deployment of penal power and the art of punishment at particular junctures. The times that we are living through are undoubtedly meet Swidler's definition of unsettled, and the conjoined framing invites us to interrogate the ways in which new popular theories emerge and then are remade. The framing tells us that we should expect debates on crime and punishment to become even more fragmented and ideologically driven, and that the wider policy environment will increasingly become characterised by contradictions between impulsions to punish and exclude and impulsions to reintegrate and affirm social solidarity. So a kind of twin dynamic that is going on there. So what illumination does the application of these ideas to the Scottish case bring? How does it help us understand the ways in which policy has transformed over the court durée, and with what consequences for those who are made subject to its tutelage? So on to the next part of it, the dynamics and impacts of institutional cultural practices. So over the past 50 years, there have been roughly three principal phases of justice in Scotland, set against a backdrop of actually increasingly unsettled lives. This whole period is probably characterised by being unsettled in different ways. The first of these phases began in the late 1960s and lasted until around the mid to late 1990s. It was predominantly welfarist in orientation, and it was set in train by the Social Work Scotland Act 1968. This act abolished, it was a very pioneering act, it abolished the form of probation service, it replaced it with social work, as well as abolishing the youth courts and setting in train the children's hearing system. The preamble to the Act stated explicitly that the function of the new institutional infrastructure was to promote social welfare. Now, the welfarist phase took place at a time of major social and economic change, characterised by economic crisis, the demise of traditional heavy industry, an increasing dissonance from the rather strident right-wing politics of the Thatcher and major governments at Westminster in the 1980s and the early 1990s, which were really increasingly out of kilter with the voting patterns in Scotland, which at that time were much more left of centre and still are. Over this time frame, welfarist policies continued to thrive, and they did so because they found anchorage in Scottish civic culture. This was predicated on communitarianism, public provision of welfare and mutual support, and underpinned by the democratic values associated with key civic institutions, such as the Scottish Church, the Presbytery, and Scottish education, as well as a longer-term socialist tradition stretching right back to the Red Clydeside era in the 1920s, and critically underpinned by being different from England. Now, I call this an imaginary, as it occurred at the same time as other things were happening in Scotland that were not so benign. It occurred at the same time as Glasgow enjoyed a reputation and was one of the most violent cities within Europe. We had high homicides rates there, organised crime was rife there, and street gang problems were rife too. And at the same time, when Scotland also had high problems of violence, it also had one of the highest imprisonment rates in Europe, As Swidler would predict, this civic culture became sharpened and more emotionally charged over the course of this phrase, manifested as a constitutional crisis and an increasingly loud claim of right for Scottish Home Rule. Institutions such as the Children's Hearing System then became emblematic of Scottishness and Scottish inclusivity, gaining imprimatur by being other to England. So you can see why Nigel Walker interpreted this as narcissism. We all thought we were marvellous in many ways, but it was also kind of undergirded by much more negative things happening under the surface. So there's a sort of dual thing going, a sort of surface level benignity, and underpinning it a much more difficult history. Anyway, all of this changed with the advent of devolution and the reinstatement of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. Rather than intensifying the Scottishness of key institutions, as you might have expected, this critical juncture saw the increased politicisation of crime and punishment as a newly elected Labour Liberal Democratic coalition government in Scotland deliberately set out to differentiate their policies from what had gone before, to build political capacity through a focus on persistent offending and antisocial behaviour. And they drew inspiration from the new Labour government at Westminster, south of the border, and its promise to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. Without undergirding research evidence that youth offending was in any way increasing, they created over 100 new institutions to deal with the aspects of crime framed by an increasingly punitive narrative. Fast-track procedures were implemented. Stringent targets were set with the persistent offender, or as the media like to call him, the NED. I'm sure you've heard that. It was sometimes defined as a non-educated delinquent, but the NED was a label attached. And also the NED's failing parents, they became a new focus of anxiety. The punitive phase came to an abrupt end in 2006-07. Fast tracking was halted following an unfavourable evaluation. And this was replaced by a more compassionate narrative following the election of a Scottish National Party administration from 2007. Again, a form of differentiation, sort of knifing off, a bit like desistance theory. You knife off politics, they knife off from the past and self-present in a different way. Now, this was exemplified by the statement made by the then Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Kenny McAskill, on the release of the man convicted of the Lockerbie bombing, saying that Scotland was a people defined by their humanity, highlighting compassion and mercy as key Scottish virtues. This phase of justice has focused on early and effective intervention and diversion from formal systems wherever possible. Latterly, there has been a growing commitment to trauma-informed practice, recognising the impact of adversarial childhood experiences on behaviour during the teenage years and into adulthood, as well as an increasing emphasis on child rights. These policy developments have culminated in the raising of the age of criminal responsibility from 8 to 12 via the 2019 Act and a new Act in 2024, the Children, Care and Justice Scotland Act, which is abolishing custody for the under 18. So maybe there is something that England can learn from Scotland here. Children and young people then in this phase have actually become subject to an inclusionary set of narratives. They're not called persistent offenders anymore, they're called children. This time frame has been characterised, however, by broader contextual turbulence, beginning with the financial crash in 2008 and with Scottishness and debates about Scottish identity getting caught up in the independence referendum of 2014 and tied to an explicitly European identity over the Brexit referendum. Now, the Scottish Government continues to offer a version of itself and of Scotland, but a version of itself as a compassionate guardian of national identity, an ideological construction of penalty that, however, belies some of its underpinning contradictions. So although we've had this overlaying of quite a benign and progressive set of policies around youth justice, imprisonment rates in Scotland continue to rise. There has been a major loss of investment in services, youth services and other services in the community that will be critical to helping transform and make work well diversionary policies. And following the financial crash, it is also possible that diversion was seen as a cheaper option than many other things. So we can't be too sort of, we have to sometimes be a little bit cynical about some of the choices that politicians make. But my point is that there is this benign and a sense of compassion on the top, but undergirding that, there can be this kind of more pernicious history. So what then have been the impacts of these shifts in regulatory practices at the aggregate and individual level? How are these macro level transformations in institutional practices caught up with individual development? How do they impact the lives of those who have grown up during these phases? So I'm going to now do a bit of change of pace in the lecture because I'm going to be showing you some data. So these slides show trends over time across the three policy phases that I have just described: in offence referrals to the reporter, to the children's hearing system, criminal convictions for 16 to 17-year-olds, and direct sentence receptions for 16 to 17-year-olds again. And what I wanted to illustrate with this is that you can see very clearly that the punitive phase, which is clearly marked on the slide there, the punitive phase, that resulted in drove up offence referrals by 50%. It drove up criminal convictions for young people by 19% and imprisonment by 10%. Whereas we can see in this more compassionate phase, more diversionary and preventative phase of policies being accompanied by major reductions, with offence referrals falling by 89% from their peak, convictions by 93%, and direct sentence to custody or receptions to custody by a whopping 98%. What this shows is, what this purportedly shows is that punitiveness and criminalisation leads to system expansion, whereas more holistic and diversionary approaches aimed at avoiding criminalisation appear to have led to system contraction. Now, one of the hypotheses that Susan and I are currently working on is that this punitive phase, which is rather interesting to us, this punitive phase may have actually had lasting effects on those who came under its tutelage, those who were fast-tracked into formal agency contact, once being known to the system that this may result in labelling and further recycling into the system. And there is some evidence of this, that this may have been happening at the aggregate level. Let me just show you this here. Now, this slide here shows the peak age of conviction in Scotland over time. And what you can see, if you look at the two curves here, over time, what we see in Scotland is that the peak age of conviction has risen over time. It used to be between the ages of 18 to 20 in the mid-1990s. It is now between the ages of 21 and 40 today. Now, this has particular resonance for the Edinburgh study cohort. They were born in 1986. The cohort then reached the age of criminal responsibility during the welfarist phase of Scottish politics, but they reached adolescence and actually their peak age of self-reported offending during the punitive and fast-tracking stage. And I feel a bit sorry for them because they came to maturity as a teenager in the most punitive phase we've ever had in Scottish juvenile law. It's very bad timing, their birth. Anyway, this peak age of conviction represented here has actually risen exactly in line with the age of our own cohort as they have transitioned from the teenage years into adulthood. So as they have matured, so has the peak age of conviction matured. The people who are in the peak age of conviction now are our cohort. So that's quite interesting. So turning then to a more focused exploration of the individual level here, Edinburgh study findings actually do provide strong evidence of labelling processes, beginning, however, in the welfarist era in the very early years and gaining particular momentum through these punitive years. As I'm going to show you now some quite a bit of data. So continuities in labelling practices in our cohort over time, we have data that shows that they create path dependencies which impact on individual identities and life chances. And a particular pernicious aspect of these practices is that they can exacerbate offending behaviour and serve to keep people in poverty, reproducing then the very conditions which bring people to the attention of agencies in the first place. I've got a lot of data in the study that evidences these dynamics, but I want to focus on 3 specific examples, and this is the first of them. Factors determining police decisions to warn or charge over time, key predictors of serious offending in the teenage years, and factors that predict NEET status, that is not being in education, employment or training, at the ages of 18 and 25. So this slide here shows police warnings or charges recorded at 3 different time points in the study. Now, police obviously are key gatekeepers to systems, and being warned or charged is one of the first major steps of being catapulted within 2 systems. And this shows police charging warning at 3 different time points: at age 12, at age 15, and at age 35. And the first thing to note in this slide here is that involvement in serious offending, as one might expect, is significantly associated with increased odds of being warned or charged at any time point. So being involved in serious offending, our measure here includes 7 items, things like assault, robbery, carrying a weapon, arson, we call it fire racing, housebreaking, stealing something out of a motor car, and joyriding in a motor car. That's our measure of serious offending. That is significantly associated with the odds, likely increased odds of being warned or charged. But even when controlling for this and a range of other variables, poverty in the form of low socioeconomic status household in the early years and neighbourhood deprivation in the adult years significantly raises the likelihood of police warnings or charges, even when controlling for involvement in serious offending, as does previous form, being known to the police in previous years, being identified as a troublemaker by the police in earlier years. At age 12, those known to the police in earlier years had almost 8 times greater odds of being charged, warned or charged at age 12, rising to just over 10 times at age 15, and over 2.5 times around 2.5 times at age 35, in comparison with those who had no such history. These findings are suggestive of continuities in decision-making practices and over time, predicated on what might be termed culturally constructed rules of recognition, involving sets of characteristics that are associated with troublemaker or criminal status. These characteristics are not always linked to the behaviour of the individual, but rather to their economic status, their neighbourhoods come from, and their institutional histories. So that's the first set of evidence I want to show you. The second set of evidence is about modelling serious offending in the teenage years. What I'm going to show you here are different trajectories of serious offending, and to show you that these different trajectories of serious offending are strongly predicted by earlier system involvement. This slide shows trajectories of self-reported offending, serious offending from the ages 13 to 17. These were the most prolific offending years amongst the cohort. And we focused on serious offending as we wanted to cut out some of the lower level antisocial behaviour and include only those things likely to be considered as serious by the police or other organisations. Latent growth curve analysis was used to identify 5 common pathways, which you can see. So the first one is the sort of line along the bottom, a no serious offending pathway, which is the biggest group, almost half of the cohort, so over half of the cohort. A persistently low and persistently high or chronic groups. The persistently high group, that yellow line in the slide, that is the smallest group of all, with only 5.9% of the cohort. These were also identified, along with 2 teen limited groups, 1 low and 1 high. When we looked at the factors which influence these different pathways, we found that a composite measure of system contact, comprising being excluded from school by age 12, being formally warned or charged by the police at age 12, or being referred to the children's reporter by age 12, all of which are regulatory processes that involve identifying or labelling children as troublesome, problematic or delinquent. This composite measure increased the likelihood of being in all 4 of the offending pathways during the teenage years, rather than being in the non-offender class. And the strength of the effect generally increased as the offending pathway became more persistent and frequent. This when controlling for a range of other personal, demographic, behavioural, familial and environmental factors, including onset of serious offending by age 12. Note that all of our measures in the modelling were taken from early childhood, so there is no overlapping with the trajectories of offending. Not only then does being known to agencies make it more likely that subsequent encounters will lead to further and more intensive intervention, but such processes appear to exacerbate rather than reduce serious offending. And the final piece of evidence I want to show is just some very summary models here, which highlights the ways in which system contact may play a significant role in reproducing poverty. This slide shows the summary results of 2 binary logistic models aimed at predicting which cohort members would be NEET at age points 18 and 35. And even when we control for a range of educational and demographic factors, the modelling shows that both early poverty, and that is a scale of poverty from household socioeconomic status, neighbourhood deprivation, and free school meal entitlement, whether you have all or more of these items. It shows that early poverty and having ever been made subject to compulsory measures of care with grounds that included offending were significantly increased the odds of being NEET at age 18 and 35. Taken together, these findings from the Edinburgh study are strongly suggestive of labelling effects, with those who had early experience of justice contact through the police or the hearing system actually having the worst outcomes in adulthood. On then to the final substantive part of the paper and the embodied experience of crime and punishment. Given that the policy backdrop of punitiveness, which the cohort experienced when they were in their teenage years, and given the labelling effects of such contacts, how were such processes perceived by the cohort? And what were their perceptions of the ways in which they affected their own well-being and their own sense of self? Here I'm going to present some of the findings from our qualitative data from the interviews that we undertook at ages 13, 18 and 35. What's quite interesting for from this qualitative data is that young people were really very aware of the labelling processes, feeling very much unjustly picked on by the police and other agencies, not only because of their behaviour, but also because of their family reputation sometimes, and because of what they were wearing or how they looked. And here are some examples, some quotations from the interviews that evidence this. So the first one is this: "But if I do get stopped or anything like that, sometimes my name, because like my dad and my uncle have been in trouble and stuff like that, so I can get a bit of hassle." So someone who has a family that has a reputation, that reputation follows the child. A second one said, "They lift you for no reason. They'll just take you and charge you. I don't really like them. It's just like stopping when they don't need to. You're just walking along the street and they'll decide to stop and search you. And then they give you a bit of cheek. And so you give them a bit of cheek back. And then they get into trouble, obviously." And a final one, makes me laugh actually, but it's also, you would hate to be the child in this case. "My friends had a car and we got pulled at the top of it." This is Ferry Road in Edinburgh, which is a really long road. So one end of the road, they got stopped by a set of police officers and then they were let go. 5 minutes later, we got pulled halfway down the road by different officers. 5 minutes later, we got pulled at the bottom of the road by a further set of officers. The police think they're young, they're wearing hats, they're in an old banging car. Oh, that car's stolen. This interviewee was furious. Interviewees also highlighted the very long reach of labelling processes, including the major impacts that it can have on employability and other kinds of life choices. Here, as one of them was saying to us, once you're into age 18, once you're involved, you can never really pull away from it. People never forget. So you've got to watch yourself. Even if you're trying to move on, they'll remember you. So the long arm of criminalisation. Another one was talking about employment chances. I spoke to a Lance, this is somebody who was trying to join the army, spoke to the Lance corporal, he gave me an application form, I had a date to go back and do my app test. I got hauled into the office and they started swearing at me and saying that I lied in my application, which I did, I know what I mean, because there were things I never disclosed in that. There was a firearms charge, that might have been the point, that I never said anything about. So he basically said, listen, get the fuck out of my office. If the and then he says, if the army's no good, give me a job. And that's the army, for fuck's sake. Then who the fuck is? And then this is the last one here is deep. I think this is deeply sad. This is somebody who's leaving prison. I think they've got a special drawer for me. They get charges and they put them in the drawer so that when I get back out and I've got nothing wrong with me, that's when they start putting them out and trying to charge me with these things. There's a kind of hopelessness about that kind of repeat cycle. This person felt constantly when they went back out again, they just got pulled back in again, and there was nothing much that they could do about it. So what is interesting about the interviews is that there appeared to be a degree of cognitive separation between consciousness of labelling and the interviewee's perception of system contact over time. Whereas first contacts with criminal justice were perceived to be quite frightening, this was quickly normalised with, and for many of our interviewees, with the exception of the most prison experienced, the criminal justice system barely featured in the narratives of their desister journeys. And here's some evidence from interviewees at age 35. So this is first justice contact. One said, that was quite a negative experience because I was very scared thinking I could go to jail. Another one said, at the time it gave me a fright because I knew it would jeopardise my future if that had been prosecuted on racial abuse, you know. But later on, this is what they were saying, courts, well, I hadn't really seen that I'd broke the law. And the worst they could do is give me a fine. So I wasn't really bothered, to be honest. There's quite a lot of to be honest in these quotations. The probation, to be honest, I didn't learn anything from it. I was just surrounded by other people that committed crime. I didn't find it as much as a punishment. It was just something I had to do. And prison, oh, sorry, I've gone there. Prison, I was less anxious as I discovered half my mates are there. And this, to me, this last one here, the last bit here, though, is, I think, very, very troubling, because he said, because I grew up in care, jail was just sort of normal. How then did people break free from the path dependencies set up by labelling processes? What supported the desister journey? Well, in keeping with much other desistance research, and we haven't found anything particularly different here, the critical factors identified by interviewees were loving relationships, partners and children, employment and responsibilities, all key aspects of the desistant pathway. And here is some examples of that. I think finding a job that I really enjoy, someone said, then finding a partner who right from day one, we got on brilliantly together, to then feeling comfortable enough to have children. And now children, I just look at them and there's no way I ever want to run the risk of ever getting sent away from them. And another one said, I've got to the point where I don't want to let people down. I want to do the things I want to do. I've got a really nice, good job. I've got a really nice partner. I've got 2 stepkids. I've got, got money. And the last one is much more succinct. Somebody who set up his own business and said, going home, dirty hands, clean money. And that sort of sums it all up. For some in our interviewee group, there had been an effort to transform their self-presentation. In Mats's terms, in the situation of interview, a number of cohort members adopted neutralization techniques. There was a denial and a minimization of their early history and a reconstruction around a more positive identity. All of the interviewees at age 35 were extremely criminal justice experienced. So the first one said, I was there, like I've never smashed a bus window, I've never stolen anything, I was just there going along with everything, but like, no, just shaking my head, I'd be laughing along with it, but never really getting involved with it, do you know what I mean? A second one said, yeah, I'm sure if people saw us, they'd probably think we were being loud and antisocial, but I sound so boring at the moment, but laughs, I'm really racking my brain over anything. There's a couple of guys I hang out with, maybe getting into fights, but it was more, defending themselves rather than going out and assaulting people. And I love this last one. This is really funny. It's very minimal. A non-moving graph, I would say, just your usual, like as I said, speeding offence, maybe theft in the sense of manipulating the system at work and things like that, and money, sort of laundering and stuff in small amounts, but that's it. The desister journey, however, is not straightforward and can be very difficult and fragile for some. in particular the need to move away from older associates and in some cases family members. And there was an imminence of crisis in the lives of most of our interviewees. It felt that if they were sort of holding it together and if just one thing went wrong, the whole thing would collapse. So one said, at first it was hard, like going away, it was so boring. It was beginning and it was a struggle, like not having to muck about with people like not having people to muck about with, because if I go muck about with these people, you wouldn't have wanted to get into trouble like that. My family's very bad. It was a nightmare, that family, but I'm no longer involved in any of them anymore. I've walked away from all that drama. And another one said, a worker from Health and Social Care Service was brilliant. And to be honest, I found it hard reaching out now, you know, saying I'm not coping. And I'm very paranoid. I know I'm very irrational just now, you know, with my paranoia. But I think if I could just keep trying to be open, it'll no snowball up and build up. And I found it incredibly hard to ask for help. It's something I still struggle with. But what then of the most prison experienced? Here was a group where we heard many heartrending stories of institutionalization and the ways that the prison experience itself inhibited rather than facilitated any attempts at transformation. Here's a quotation that illustrates this. Institutionalized, he said, definitely know what I mean. Hardened to all these horrific things that if a normal person seeing that in the street, they'd be traumatized by some of it. You know what I mean? I've seen guys getting ears chopped off in here, literally ears chopped off and slashed to bits for the slightest thing, and that's on public record. I want to live in peace, but it takes money and things like that. I want to take a degree in archaeology and that, but I can't. Well, I probably could, but I don't know if you could do that with a criminal record and that. I'm no clued up on that kind of stuff. Another said, I've got mental health problems and I suffer from paranoia. I've got anxiety, things like that. Know what I mean? I don't know if it's that just being in jail all these years or all the things I've seen in jail that's happening. Another said, I've had to cut most of my relationships off because I've ended up in jail. Fucking, there's so many, I can't remember their names. I mean, there's no point in being in jail and having a relationship. And finally, I can't cope outside. Know what I mean? It's like I've been in jail all these years and I go outside and it's just, there's nothing for me. In sum, these prison interviewees and this data shows that we have a system that is currently framed by a policy narrative which proclaims Scotland's mercy and compassionate outlook, but one which is destroying the very life chances of those it most needs to help and the ones that it most wants to help, but is utterly failing. So, on to some concluding reflections. I began the lecture with Walker's contention that criminologists should avoid penal reform and stick with scientific fact. The evidence I've presented today suggests that instead that facts about crime, from criminal justice statistics to patterns of self-report, are culturally constructed, profoundly shaped by the political and sometimes moral choices made by governments and by the institutions working across the criminal justice system. A deep time approach indicates that the tendencies manifested in regulatory practices are long-standing and deeply culturally imbued, with sites of cultural domination underscored as much by fear and anxiety and exclusionary dynamics as by more inclusive or rehabilitative impulsions. Indeed, the particular configurations of crime and punishment at any given moment cannot be understood without proper engagement with political questions. More than this, though, the history of transformation in crime and punishment, I believe, places particular responsibilities on us as researchers. Knowledge production is often treated as an end in itself, but when we are entrusted with stories of tremendous injustice, when our data highlight practices which have deleterious outcomes, or even if it evidences factors which are about diminishing serious offending and which are supportive of individual and social well-being, then it behoves us to mobilise the soft power of universities to try to seek change. Findings from the Edinburgh study have been influential in policy in Scotland over the compassionate phase. We have given confidence in some way to governments to it's not just the Edinburgh study, but we have certainly had an influence here to given them confidence to raise the age of criminal responsibility, to sustain diversionary practices and to support early intervention. Policy influence is not easy. It requires persistence and resilience. And it leaves us also, Susan and I, in a slightly unethical or unethically interesting position that we have actually influenced the field in which we are actually now researching. And while everything in Scotland is not perfect and progress remains deeply fragile, I remain fiercely proud of the hard-won impacts that our research has had, and more importantly, what these changes actually stand for. In this age of unreason and against this very unsettled backdrop, that for me is why criminology matters. Thank you. So I just want to end with my own personal tribute to Professor David Farrington. A nice picture of him here. Susan and I were invited by Maria to write a little epitaph for David, which I hope will be published at some point. And I just want to read a little bit of that, and then I want to read you a little bit of Burns, being a narcissistic Scot. So there can be few people within the world of criminology who have not read an article, chapter, book or review written by David. He is one of the most prolific scholars of our time. He was incredibly generous with his time, his ideas and his data. And in an academic world which can be fraught sometimes with intellectual jealousies and competitive rivals, David really sat above such petty matters and was happy to forge, I think, a collective path of theoretical enlightenment. David's not only to be remembered though as a serious scholar, so Susan and I in our tribute to him also mentioned that he was a very fine dancer. If you went to the European Society of Criminology, you could see him on the dance floor. And I do think there is a correlation or some research to be done on the relationship between being a very fine dancer and being a great criminologist, because there's more than one person in this room who is both a great criminologist and a great dancer. We will remember David as a jovial, down-to-earth, kind-hearted spirit who was always willing to answer an email, offer advice, or point us in the right direction of a notable source, whether or not it was written by him. And it's going to be a long time till we see his likes again. Anyway, as a Scot, I offer this epitaph in his memory by Robert Burns, our national bard, and it is called On a Friend. Let me read it to you. An honest man here lies at rest, and ere God with his image blessed, the friend of man, the friend of truth, the friend of age and guide of youth. Few hearts like his with virtue warmed, few heads with knowledge so informed. If there's another world, he lives in bliss. If there is none, he made the best of this. Thank you, David.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. A very good series of questions. Please, let's thank Lesley for this fantastic talk. Thank you very much for coming here, for sharing your thoughts with us, inspiring us, and helping us to think in a new way about what to do and how to link research and practice. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Please join us for some